Welcome everybody to the APPG for Childcare and Early Education. My name's David Simmons. I'm the Member of Parliament for Islip North and Nuffield. And for those of you I haven't met, particularly great to welcome you to this call. I've stepped in place of Steve Brine, who is speaking in a parliamentary debate at the moment. This afternoon's session is around the topic of social mobility. And we've got a galaxy of stars of speakers to open that debate. Each bringing a different perspective from the Department for Education, from the perspective of a backbench member of Parliament, but with experience in this area in the community, and some more academic and practitioner perspectives that we're going to hear about in just a moment. Before we start with our first speaker, I'd just like to remind everybody that we have a campaign coming up very shortly, and I think most of you will have had some information that's been circulated by Hannah, because the campaign and the week of campaign really is about an opportunity to highlight all sorts of issues to do with childcare and early education. I'm just going to ask Hannah, did you want to say a little bit about that? Because I know you've been asking people to engage with the social media materials and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, David. So the campaign's taking place next week. It's called Childcare and Early Education Week. And we really want it to be a chance to celebrate the sector and everything that it does to educate children across the country. But we also want to facilitate relationship building between settings and their local MP as well. So I will put details in the chat with an email address that you can get in touch with if you want to support the campaign, whether you're a parliamentarian or you're a practitioner, and we will send you our toolkit so that you can get involved. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Hannah. And definitely, please do engage with that. And any inquiries you'd like to raise about the campaign and how you can get more involved, please do connect them to Hannah. Particularly also like to welcome James Daly, who's one of my backbench colleagues to the call. One of a numerous cohort of Conservative members of Parliament, and I think cross-party really, who've got a real interest in early years, and it's great to see that wider engagement. Now, our first speaker is due to be Vicky Ford. I haven't seen Vicky join the call yet, but we're a minute or so ahead of schedule for when we were expecting her, I think. So, Hannah, is Vicky with us yet?
We don't have Vicky just yet. So if we go to Iram first, and then when Vicky joins us, we can pass on.
Fantastic. All right. Well, so in a moment, we're going to hear from the Children's Minister. But what we'll do, if we may, we'll start with Iram Siraj, who's Professor of Child Development and Education at Oxford University. Iram, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. That's great. I'm going to touch on 4 areas of early childhood education which I feel impact social mobility strongly. Firstly, the quantity and quality conundrum. Secondly, support for the early home learning environment, I'll refer to as HLE. Thirdly, person and society-wide outcomes. And fourthly, workforce professionalisation. We know that early childhood is a time of rapid development. It's when a person's life potential is maximised or minimised, impacting on society's potential being maximised or minimised. 80% of the human brain is developed by 5. The 17-year EPSI study showed learner trajectories in maths and English were going up and down between the ages of 3 and 6. But after this, they were pretty much set for the rest of the learning life course. The cheapest time for changing whole population trajectories is before age 6. Interventions after this are much more expensive and often less effective. This means preschool is the single most important time for setting the foundations for social mobility. The longitudinal EPSI and SEED studies funded by the DFE over the last 25 years prove conclusively that an early start to education benefits all children, which isn't the same as childcare, but particularly those from disadvantaged families. The two, of course, overlap. We all know the Matthew effect, where the more advantaged increasingly add to their advantage and the less advantaged increasingly become less advantaged. This is fact, not theory, and should have big implications for universal policies. It's not mind the gap, it's watch out, the gap is getting bigger. All the evidence shows that early education is the best and cheapest way of narrowing the gap. So it's a puzzling policy which redirects money to more affluent families, as does the requirement for 16 hours work or study for 30 hours free childcare. This is not accepted by Scotland and Wales, and I know many families where the parent cannot work due to domestic abuse or looking after disabled family. Their preschool children are severely disadvantaged by not being able to access any provision, or only the 15 hours. They're being set back for life, and inevitably society suffers too. And of course, they're set back if they're two, it's even less time. More time at home under the pandemic means more exposure to the early HLE or lack of it. And the SEED study has found that the home learning environment is inexplicably associated with higher verbal and non-verbal ability. This is important because the whole of learning is embedded on that. More household disorder is associated with less pro-social and cooperation, higher parental psychological distress, with lack of limiting setting for children is associated with poorer verbal ability and higher levels of emotional symptoms and behaviour problems. Higher parental-child closeness is associated with higher verbal ability and more pro-social behaviour, as well as lower hyperactivity and peer problems. The APPG studies showed the two factors, the early home learning environment and the quality of preschool provision, as seen in its staff educational leadership and higher qualifications, shape learning outcomes up to GCSE and beyond. Free school meals are receiving all the significant attention at the moment, but early education settings can support vulnerable children through general healthy eating throughout the day, plus guidance for parents. Unfortunately, these services have had major cuts. Children's centres supported families with health and nutrition advice, with links to health visitors with one-stop holistic services. New research shows one of the biggest gaps between advantaged and disadvantages is in physical development, with disadvantaged children less likely to get out and engage in physical activities. The soon-to-be published OECD English PISA of 5-year-olds shows clearly that the gap between rich and poor is very clear in physical development, is strongly correlated with SEND, cognitive and social development. Physical development and physical activity underpin cognitive and language development, including executive function. Again, an emphasis on physical development need not be expensive and would bring long-term society-wide benefits at all proportion to the cost. Our current preschoolers will enter the workforce in around 2040. So is our early years workforce fit for purpose of driving up social mobility? Not yet. APPG and other studies have shown that a workforce with at least 50% graduate teachers and 50% further education trained staff provide the high quality provision society needs in terms of quality interactions, curriculum and well-being. Our early years workforce provides a frontline service. We ask them to extend children's thinking, to assess appropriately, to plan for learning, to stimulate communication, to enhance self-regulation, to help children learn what it means to be human in the age of artificial intelligence. Yet there is clear evidence that in the rush to increase the quantity of provision, we may be lowering standards in the education of the workforce, and so reducing the quality of provision. The Education Endowment Foundation have recently shown that in 2019, the gap in the early years foundation state profile widened for the first time in years. The focus on increasing access to childcare has led to quality being neglected. We desperately need to review the system. There needs to be a paradigmatic shift away from a system whose purpose is to largely provide childcare, to release parents to work, to a system whose purpose is namely to lay the foundations of human development and to maximise individual and society-wide potential. Whatever the sector, early intervention is always the cheapest, always the most cost-effective, always the most beneficial, but often not recognised as such. I hope that was 5 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Iram. A really, really good explanation of the practical reasons why, as Steve, our chair, and others have highlighted, it's the money that we spend on the early years that makes the biggest difference of a child's life course. And you really set out the practical reasons why that is the case in your presentation. I'd now like to welcome Vicky Ford, the Children's Minister, who has joined us. Vicky, as many of you know, has been very active in the space of early years, and as somebody who is myself a parent of very young children, I found it really helpful to have a minister who takes such an interest in this, and particularly during this period of COVID, when the sector has been under huge pressure, has been very proactive in trying to address the issues that have been raised by early years representatives. So Vicky, you are most welcome.
Thank you so much. Can you see me? Because I think I've got a problem with my video.
We can hear you fine. I can't see you on my screen at the moment.
Do you mind it? I'm really, really sorry. Shall I just carry on talking, or shall I go and try and find a different device?
I would speak to us. I think
let's carry on talking, and I really, really do apologise. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to come and speak to you all today. And I actually really enjoyed listening to that first presentation. It is such an important issue about how the early years affect social mobility. The government has been very clear. We want to create a country where the circumstances of a child's birth don't determine their outcomes in life. And it is so important that this is addressed from the very, very beginnings of lives through childcare and early education. Two of our overriding ambitions in the Department for Education are to support the most vulnerable and disadvantaged, and to provide the best start in life. And as the Children's Minister, I've set out 4 clear early years objectives: to improve the uptake of early education, to improve the quality of early years education, improve outcomes at the age of 5, and reduce the outcomes gap at the age of 5. And following these objectives will indeed promote social mobility. And as a key part, as we keep talking about levelling up. And that is at the most crucial point of the child's development, those early years. And actually, I'm very proud that a huge amount of work has already been done by this. I keep saying it again and again, but since 2013, the proportion of children that achieve a good level of development at the end of reception year has gone from being 1 in 2 to nearly 3 out of 4 children when it was measured in 2019. We've been reforming the early years foundation stage to improve early years outcomes for all children, particularly disadvantaged children, in the critical areas that build the foundations for later success, such as in language development and literacy. And this is more important than ever in the context of COVID and the pandemic, and missed time in learning and missed communication skills. This is all why the department committed over £60 million since 2018 to programmes to improve early language and literacy, £26 million to set up a network of English hubs, £20 million investment in professional development for early years practitioners, £8.5 million on our local government programme, and then through the partnership with the EEF, over £6 million to understand what works. Now, we know that tragically that pandemic has presented huge challenges in all areas across society, and the early years sector has certainly not been unscathed. So can I please take this opportunity to thank so deeply those in the childcare sector for everything they've done so far and all they're continuing to do. I know it is extremely difficult, that the work that you're doing in letting critical workers get back into their jobs, continuing to care for children who are vulnerable, providing care for children throughout this pandemic has been crucial. And it's been most crucial for the children themselves. And I do get asked a lot of times to repeat, why have we said that early years should remain open in this time when schools are close to so many children? And there are 3 reasons that they're all important, and they all have to be balanced against each other. But firstly and formally, early education gives children those communication and social skills that set them up for life. You cannot care for a very small child online, and you cannot get those early months back. Secondly, the public health advice remains that children are less susceptible to the virus, even to the new variant, and that they play a lower role in transmission. And that's because usually younger children have lower contact outside their household. So if you imagine, you know, kids coming out of a primary school that's normally that would be open, or a secondary school that normally open, they'd be going off to meet other friends or other groups. Early years children don't tend to do that. They tend to have lower levels of contact outside their household when they're away from their setting, and therefore there's less of an impact on transmission. And thirdly, the evidence at the moment is that the confirmed case rates of COVID amongst the very youngest children are the lowest of all age groups, and that's an important fact too. Now, we know that you have a lot of challenges, and ensuring the safety of children, the workforce and families is all of our priorities. We've been working really hard since I met with stakeholders back immediately after the announcement of the schools restricting opening. We've been working really hard to introduce asymptomatic testings into early years settings. It was first introduced in secondary schools and colleges and then to primary schools, but we have been working to get that asymptomatic testing to early years settings, including to child minors. We need to work with health and MHCLG on this. The fastest way for this at the moment to be delivered is through the community rapid asymptomatic testing, which is being run by local authorities. That was announced on Sunday, the 10th of January, and started to be rolled out last week. I have written to directors to local authorities and urged them to prioritise that asymptomatic testing for early years staff. And we are continuing to work on seeing if we can have more direct approaches and more direct ways of getting those asymptomatic tests into early years settings. So I'm still working on it, but at the moment, the fastest way is through the community testing. On vaccinations, as I've said before, the JCVI has advised those first priorities of the vaccination programme should be on the prevention of mortality and the maintenance of health and social care systems. And that is why the initial rollout of prioritisation is based on age. If you have an early years staff who's in over 50 or is one of those who is more clinically vulnerable, then they will be prioritised in that first phase out. But the JCVI have also asked the government to look at occupational vaccination in the next phase. And I really do assure you that I am advocating for early years practitioners as part of this. It will be a cross-government exercise, but I've already had warm-up conversations with the vaccines minister, although I have to say, again, it will be JCVI that will be looking at that, because they need to balance all different sectors. I want to talk about financial support. We want to provide the security to nurseries and childminders who are open to the children who need it. We have provided that unprecedented support throughout the pandemic, and further investment next year, the extra 44 million from the spending review to increase the hourly rates for childcare providers for their entitlement offers. We're increasing the minimum funding floor, and then we're also obviously looking really closely at the number of children attending this term. We know it has not returned to normal levels, but we wanted to give more clarity on how the census will work in light of that. So whilst the census guidance itself is unchanged, we've issued technical advice on how to use that guidance and how to apply it this year. In summary, if a child is reasonably expected to attend the early years provision and that provision is made available to the provider, then the expected hours could be recorded in the census. So that means that children can be counted who, if it was not for the impact of the virus on their own personal circumstances or on the operation of the early years setting, they can be counted that they would be attending the provision. And so that includes counting children whose parents are currently keeping them at home because the parents are concerned about COVID, provided that the place is open to that child. Children this includes children who've previously attended the provision and children who were expected to start attending at the beginning of this January term. We are closely monitoring parental take-up of places and the capacity and responses of providers. We're keeping it under constant review as to whether further action is needed. We know that because of the closure of early education settings, some children did miss out on a period of formal early education last year. So we've worked hard to limit the detrimental effect of that. Children who are currently in reception year, who may have missed out on some of their formal early education settings at the outset of COVID, they are able to benefit from our investment in the Nuffield Early Language Intervention, NELI. It's a £9 million investment, and over 40% of primary schools have now signed up for this programme. It's a programme that's based on very robust evidence, which is proven to improve oral language skills in that year. Staff training is delivered online, so it can proceed, and we will be providing further advice to participating schools. We have prioritised schools in areas of higher disadvantage for that. And on top of that, we're investing £20 million into the high quality professional development programme for early years practitioners. That's to drive up standards in early language and literacy amongst pre-reception children. It works in disadvantaged areas in 51 different local authorities. So just again, that's the most up-to-date summary I can give you at this moment. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and for all of your continued support, working incredibly hard with the childcare sector. Please do keep giving us the feedback from the ground. I know that the stakeholders here are in constant dialogue with the earliest team. The work that you do to support every child to reach their potential is an absolute priority for me. I had the dear glory for a couple of years of helping to run as a volunteer a preschool in my own local community. You are amazing people, and I have such respect for what you do. It is a very challenging time.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for joining us and for that presentation. Just would add, there are quite a few questions coming up in the chat, in particular about vaccinations and about risk and about testing. The Education Select Committee this morning had Russell Viner, who's the head of the Royal College of Paediatricians, Jenny Harries, who's the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and two other witnesses with the direct relevant scientific and professional experience. And that session is available online, but it would be worth watching because a lot of these questions are covered in there. Essentially, what Jenny Harries and Russell Viner both said was the reason why early years is open is that it is an exceptionally safe environment. So the younger the children become, the less risk there is, so that the justification for requiring people to have tests at work in an exceptionally low risk environment isn't there. Jenny also highlighted that they have been tracking the prevalence of COVID amongst particular people in the workforce, and that teachers, early years workers are at the same or lower risk than anybody in other walk of life. So there's no additional risk to people, to adults working with children, over and above what will be found in a supermarket or in an office or in a factory or in a public transport operation or a science lab or something like that. And it also important, she highlighted the point that because people have been vaccinated does not mean that they don't have to self-isolate if there's an outbreak. So vaccination for school staff and for early years staff would not at the moment remove the need to still shut for 10 days when there's been a case. So you'll see Matt Hancock is having to self-isolate even though he's already had COVID, because it does not guarantee your immunity, and therefore the self-isolation rules still apply. So that's one of the reasons why the vaccination session, as Jenny highlighted this morning, is more complex. So there's lots of finance questions as well, but I just would perhaps pick those up with you in a moment, Minister, if that's okay.
I think that would be really helpful if I can. And again, apologies for the lack of video. I think it would be really useful if people could listen to that summary of what you had at the Select Committee, and maybe we can find a way to circulate that evidence as well. I mean, again, the youngest children tend to have the lowest levels on community transmission. And the reason that we had to restrict schools was not because of safety in schools, it was because the impact of community transmission, people moving in and out and around about, back to school, etc., what people were doing after and before school, as well as that was having the impact. And because these very young children tend to have less contacts, fewer different households than older ones, that was the original advice and modelling about why you have less of an impact on the R factor from early years. We've also got the lowest levels of case rates of COVID amongst very young children at any age group in the country. And that has been a very important part of that. And it's also speaking very closely to Public Health England about those containment measures, those safety measures that they've put into nurseries to minimise the transmission in the setting. In terms of funding, the work that we did with Treasury when we agreed that 44 million for the 6p for 3 and 4 year olds, the 8p for 2 year olds, we are going to share the math behind that. We've agreed to do that with the sector to show how that should more than cover the uplift in the minimum wage for when that comes in April. It's to do with the ratios. You know, you're getting the increased funding for all the children, and yet you have a ratio of 1 member of staff to X number of children, but we will be passing the maths behind that on. In terms of why I mentioned primary schools, so the work that we've done in the primary school reception year to catch up those young children who missed out on the last term and a half of early years at the beginning of the year, and therefore by the time they got to reception they'd fallen back again on language and communication skills. So that's why we've put the Nelly programme and funded that to help them to catch up. Okay, so because those are the children who progressed into from early years into reception this year. So where I'm looking at some of the other ones. So early years, well, I do understand in terms of vaccinations, the case that's been made to be by the sector that, you know, in early years, you know, we know you can't have the same social distancing that you would have with older children. It's the same in a special school, and I'm making that case when we start talking about vaccinations by occupation.
It's probably worth just saying this. Hannah rather brilliantly has already put up the session. Now, I appreciate that the session is about an hour and a half in total length, so not everybody's going to have a chance to look at it now, but we really did push Jenny Harries and Russell Viner on this point about safety, and they were extremely clear that studies from all around the world have demonstrated that adults who are working with children are at no greater, and in many cases a lesser risk than adults who are working in any other working context. So, you know, to describe a nursery and an early years setting as a safe environment by comparison with any other workplace, including schools and other things, social work that people may be doing, it is an extremely safe environment in which to be working. But she was also very clear that vaccination would not enable staff to carry on working when there was a COVID case in a nursery or a primary school or anything like that. Vaccination does not at the moment give you that freedom.
That's, yes, at the moment we don't know how much the vaccination stops people transmitting, or indeed why it does. There was one more question about local authorities not passing on the funding that we've given them, and I know that NDNA have done a considerable amount of work on this and have been doing FOI requests on local authorities. They're working very closely with the department to look at where that's been an issue and to really encourage. I've been encouraging from the very beginning local authorities to pass that on, but we are chasing that up. And if that's okay, I'm afraid I think I might need to rush because I'm meant to be meeting Secretary of State.
Indeed, we'll give him our best
wishes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your time. Now I'm going to move straight on to introduce our next speaker. We've got Dr. Nathan Archer from the Nuffield Foundation. Just I spotted you on the screen a moment ago, Nathan. Yep, there you are. So Nathan, the floor is yours.
Very much, Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to contribute to the conversation this afternoon. I've got a short presentation. If I could just share that, just a few slides. Can I just check that people can see that? Yeah, great, thank you. So I'll start at the beginning. It's a good place to start, isn't it? So I wanted to share some work that I'm undertaking at the Nuffield Foundation with colleagues Kerry Oppenheim and Jordan Rehill, and this is a cross-cutting project called The Changing Face of Early Childhood in Britain. And we're in the midst of producing a number of thematic reviews, which are syntheses of recent research and recommendations for policy and practice and research as well, our outcomes. And in particular, I wanted to just draw on a couple of those that are forthcoming. So we've got the changing patterns of poverty and vulnerability in early childhood due out shortly. And then I'm currently working on the review 4, which is about the way in which early years shapes the life chances of young children. So I wanted to just draw on those two. Whilst the presentation is obviously not exhaustive in 5 minutes, what I've tried to do is draw out some key studies which I think highlight the impact of early education on social mobility, firstly for children, secondly for families, and thirdly for early educators. So the first slide is around the impact for children, and as Professor Siraj mentioned, the advantages of early education are well established and well known from extensive longitudinal studies such as EPSI and SEED. But the features which create those advantages, I think, are a bit more widely debated. And so there are various studies going on into the process and structural quality issues. One element of that research, I think, is the input of graduates in early childhood settings. And I wanted to reference a report by Sarah Bonetti and Joe Blandon that was issued last year, which highlighted a positive association between the presence of an input of a graduate in a setting and children's later profile scores. So I think that strengthens the long-standing and ongoing call for greater investment in graduates in settings to continue to improve the life chances of young children. That said, the profile scores that have already been mentioned have stalled in recent years. In 2018, for the first time, the gap between the scores of disadvantaged children and their more advantaged peers increased, albeit marginally, and by 2019 it had returned to 2015 levels. So over that 5-year period, no progress had been secured in closing the gap. To turn to the extension of the 33 hours, which has already been mentioned, that's clearly made a difference to more children accessing more funded hours. But we've seen a move away from the initial aims of that policy about improving children's outcomes through early education to reducing the cost of childcare for working parents. So eligibility for that fund is determined by family earnings, and that prompts questions about equity of access by low-income families. Again, returning to the Bonetti and Blandon report, they found a positive association between children attending early years settings with a graduate for more than 15 hours a week, and the profile scores of those children who later went on to be eligible for free school meals during their schooling. So that suggests a disconnect in policy terms between those families who are eligible for 30 hours and this idea of closing the attainment gap. And that's an issue that's been raised by the Education Select Committee in their report, Tackling Disadvantage in the Early Years, who suggest that the 30 hours free childcare policy is actually widening the gap in between advantaged and disadvantaged children, thereby entrenching inequality. And my final point on that slide is that questions remain about the right balance being struck between, on the one hand, supporting child development and learning through early education, and on the other hand, enabling parental employment to access to flexible childcare. So turning to families, I've talked about the eligibility of the 30 hours childcare policy and its impact on children's access to early years provision, but it also impacts on parents' earning ability. More affluent parents are more likely than others to report financial benefit from the scheme. And that's further complicated by the range of charges and conditions and restrictions which some settings are having to attach to the extended offer in order to remain sustainable. And that means that parents pay varying amounts. And then to turn to demand side funding, we've seen quite substantial increases in demand side funding. And an example of this is the tax-free childcare, but that's had limited take-up. Apparently in the last 3 years, the government spent £385 million against an initial forecast of 2.1 billion, illustrating the low take-up. And the IFS has shown that in recent years, demand side funding has shifted away from low-income families to working families. And again, that generates further questions about equity of access. More broadly on childcare affordability, we know that low wage employment offers parents no or very little financial gain once childcare costs have been taken into account. So the OECD have found 4 countries, including the UK, in those countries, low earning single mothers and mothers in low earning couples entering work can lose up to 90% of their earnings in childcare costs. So there remains questions again of the affordability of provision, and particularly for children under 3 and for those hours that are paid for around the funded entitlements, which are often having to be inflated to cross-subsidise underfunded entitlement hours. And then finally, to turn to early educators, early education as employment also impacts on the social mobility of its workforce. So there are multiple sources of evidence which highlight the low pay and precarity of the workforce. The Social Mobility Commission found the workforce increasingly unstable, and they highlighted that 1 in 6 early years workers leaves employment within a year, and many people take second jobs just in order to make ends meet. CEDA have shown us that 32% of providers are recruiting for an estimated 14,000 posts, and in 2019, turnover in the sector was at 24%. We also know from NDNA research that staff leaving the sector are mainly heading to retail jobs, with salaries and policy changes being given as the main reasons. And the well-documented gap between the cost of offering this funded entitlement and the funding that's received continues to suppress salaries, making this one of the lowest paid sectors. So much of the research that I cited, it precedes the pandemic. So I've just added this very brief sort of COVID postscript just to highlight a few issues that I think we need to be mindful of in the months ahead. We know that from the 7th of January, just 37% of the normal number of children were attending settings during term time. So it'll be really important to monitor both the access of provision and the take-up of places in the months ahead, and consider the impact for young children's learning and development. On parental employment, the organisation Working Families have shown us that single parents and parents of disabled children in particular have been affected by lack of access to childcare, with many single parents already twice as likely as couples to be living in poverty. And then finally, on this issue of setting sustainability, a survey carried out by the Early Years Alliance in November found that 45% of settings said they were unlikely to be viable within 6 months, and a third of settings in disadvantaged areas reported they were unlikely to be operating later this year. So there are clearly many current policies coupled with the COVID pandemic that are resulting in impacts on social mobility for children and families and educators, and it will be important to continue to follow the research and developments in the months ahead. And I just share a couple of these projects that I'm working on, and of course there are many more out there. I'll happily feed findings of these back into the APPG if that's of interest in the months ahead. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nathan. Just a quick question on me with chair's privilege, if I may, about international benchmarks. So I know I've done quite a lot of stuff here myself in the past in respect of teachers, which looked at, for example, the fact that teaching in the UK is relative to the rest of Europe, certainly quite well paid, but not necessarily seen as the high social status that you often find in the Nordic countries, where it's lower paid, but seen as more important. Do you have any view about international comparisons around the early years workforce?
It's a complex question because we have such a fragmented sector in the UK, which is divided between, as you know, a kind of mixed market of childminders, private and voluntary settings, and then of course maintained provision as well. And I think because many of the regulatory requirements, the initial education and the funding is very different between those subsectors, it's incredibly difficult to draw comparisons. with other countries, although I'm aware there's extensive work that's been done by OECD and EU that I can happily share at some point if it's of use.
Thank you. Right, Steve has been able to rejoin us following his absence to do his speech. So at this point, I'm going to step away from the chair and hand it back. Thank you all very much indeed for being brilliant speakers, and to everybody else for being so well behaved. Steve, over to you.
David, thank you. It's just, I think it shows what strength and depth we've got in this all-party group, not just the speakers that we attract, but within the people who are able to support me in running the group. David, thank you so much for stepping in. You really saved the day. It was a busy day here in the House with the trade bill, so I was able to get my points on the record in that. And I heard the last 10 minutes or so of the minister, so thank you, David, for pushing her on some of those things. I'm sorry she couldn't stay longer, but actually, having done quite a lot of these all-party groups as a minister, I think we did actually have her for over 30 minutes, which is quite a long time to have a minister at an all-party group meeting. So thank you for that, Dr. Archer, as well. Very interesting and spot on question. We've got to finish at 4. So without further ado, Julie Hyde, who's Executive Director at Cash. Thanks so much for being here, Julie. Over to you, all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully that works.
Yep.
Can we see that?
We got it.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I'll try and keep it as concise as I possibly can, Chair. So this is regarding, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this afternoon. Firstly, this is regarding social mobility and how the qualification framework supports achievement. That's not just of the workforce, but also of young people in their care. So just to start with, the early years workforce strategy in 2017 included a commitment by the DfE to develop careers pathways, stating we want to support the workforce to develop both professionally and personally, and want staff to understand how to achieve their career goals. The sector is diverse, offering many opportunities for progression, whatever the starting point, and it is this that will promote social mobility. By capturing and appreciating interest and skills and nurturing skills, knowledge and expertise to progress and achieve. Qualifications available offer different pathways for learners, ranging from level 1 through to level 5, with opportunities to progress to level 6 and beyond. The richness of choice brings the opportunity for social mobility. The qualification offer is available through a range of different routes, starting at 14 to 16 in secondary school. As the Early Years Workforce Commission report, which was published yesterday, states, we need to actively promote careers advice for those in the sector and those looking for a rewarding career path. Schools must be encouraged to undertake strong careers advice programs which promote a career in early years. Progression can be through a classroom-based technical or T-level program, which includes the early years educator competency criteria, or alternatively, young people may do an applied general, which would be taken alongside A-levels. We have to understand that all people learn in different ways, and a variety of routes is fundamentally important. And then we move on to apprenticeship pathways. Apprenticeship standards at level 2 and level 3 include the early years criteria-based qualifications, the early years practitioner at level 2 and the early years educator at level 3, and offer students and employers a practical progression route. But we also have to remember that year on year there has been a 25% drop in apprentices in early years. Reversing this is critical to supporting the future of the sector. Each qualification, regardless of level, is a step towards a progressive career that provides for social mobility for the learners and inspiration for the beneficiaries, the children and their families alike. The Early Years Workforce Commission's report research showed that 62% of respondents stressed that improved professional development would support their employees to continue providing excellent teaching to young children and to obtain the qualifications that would attract higher wages. CPD within the sector is vital to supporting the workforce development. The first years of a child's life is crucial in influencing their chances later in life and for social mobility, as it's when the gap in outcomes between poorer children and their affluent peers first takes hold. It's been well established that early years learning is key in providing the foundations for future educational attainment. From the Nutt-Brown Review in 2012, where 19 recommendations were made and only 5 were implemented, to today, where those recommendations are still valid, with the addition of the 5 that were proposed in the Early Years Workforce Review in 2020, to add a vision for the workforce, to add access to benchmark qualifications, i.e. level 3, access to CPD, graduate leadership, which has been discussed already, pay and conditions, which has already been covered. The increase in unqualified staff and a downward trend in the number of level 3 qualified staff is a sustainability issue. There was a challenge in the sector prior to COVID. COVID has exacerbated the situation. In relation to the number of students qualified in recent years, there is a general downward trend in the number of vocational certificates issued from 2012 onwards across all levels. Post-2017, there appears to be a slight upturn, which you can see on the chart, which could be attributed to the change in requirements in English and maths after functional skills was reinstated as being equivalent to GCSE maths and English as part of the workforce strategy, which was released in March 2017. The COVID pandemic has allowed those working in the early years space to look at what happens when access to childcare is taken away. 53% of parents of 2 to 4-year-olds whose children had not been able to attend their childcare provider said that the situation had a negative effect on their child's social and emotional development. C to D parents are more likely to cite their child's learning and development as a reason for their child returning to the childcare provider. 48% of those as opposed to 37% of ABC1 parents. It's worth noting that Amanda Spielman, the Ofsted Chief Inspector, said in the annual report last December, what closures have reminded us about here is the importance of consolidation in learning. The knowledge and skills that matter aren't learned instantly. They have to be practiced and reinforced, ideally both at home and in school. As a critical sector, the importance of testing and vaccination for our staff and students must be a priority, as has already been stated here today. The findings of the APPG study, which Nathan has covered and have already been touched on as well by Iram, showed that early years education had an impact and a far-reaching impact beyond the classroom. The costs of establishing and sustaining a highly qualified early years workforce are significant, but should be seen as an investment in human capital for future generations and a signal of the importance given to securing social mobility for our left behind young children. And finally, the urgency in developing a well-qualified and professionalised early years workforce which has the capacity to transform young lives, especially for those from less advantaged homes, remains. Only by supporting the sector in a strategic, joined-up way can we sustain a high-quality service, which is crucial for the future of the UK's economy, and I would say more importantly, for the outcomes of young people. Thank you.
Julie, thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. You clearly put a lot of work into it, and thanks for sharing such clear slides with us all. Delighted to welcome a colleague from the other side of the house to the group now is Fleur Anderson, who's the new MP for Putney, a member of the Education Select Committee as well. And Fleur and I spoke together in Westminster Hall last week when Fleur led a debate on the impact of COVID on early years. And delighted that she's joined the all-party group meeting today. I hope she will become a member of the all-party group if she's not already.
Will. Good recruitment.
Great. There she is. There she is with Putney sign behind her. Brilliant. Welcome, Fleur. It's really great to see you. Would you like to say a few words?
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you everyone for coming today. I think it's been a really, really important meeting, and it's really important to say what it's been said in the chat box, and we're not hearing anything new, but I think it's really important to hear what each other are saying, and to speak up for the early years sector, especially now, maybe more than ever, that we need to have this conversation. So I've really enjoyed the speakers before me. I've learned a lot, and thank you very much. And I've really enjoyed the chat box going alongside as well. So I hope you keep that up. And I realise that we're short on time, so I won't speak for very long, but I just have some points to make, which very much reiterate some of the points made already. And I don't need to say to this audience the importance of early years education in social mobility, and to really make the case for that, because I think it's been well made up to now, and I think you're here in this meeting because you are signed up for that. So I just want to focus on some of the areas in which we need to make sure that we focus on support for the early years sector, to make sure that we have an increase in social mobility, but we don't bake in any potential problems that were there before COVID, and that COVID has exacerbated, and therefore that we might see that just remain there, or make the early years sector go backwards, because so much work is being done, and fantastic work, but we are not seeing that increase in social mobility, or that the gap of disadvantage as children enter school decreasing as much as we should. We shouldn't be languishing where we are on the OECD tables of disadvantage and gaps in equality. And I'd much rather talk about social justice than social mobility at times, but it should be a goal we all look for. Some of the points that I made and the calls I made for in the debate last week are for early years sector to have parity with schools. I think it's just been seen in many of the announcements from the DfE. Early years was just left out many times, and there are just many other ways during which this crisis it's been seen that there is not a parity, and there should be. So parity with schools in terms of provision of PPE, in terms of getting testing, I know is still a problem. I know that from my local nurseries. And I asked that again from the medical experts this morning in the Education Select Committee, of how we're going to get equality of testing. And it cannot be, as my nursery head teachers have been told, to go to the local town hall, it's quite far away, at times when they're in school. That just can't work. Also, the COVID catch-up fund. COVID catch-up is going to be absolutely crucial. At least maintained state nurseries should have the equality of access, but it also should be all nursery schools have equality of access to that COVID catch-up fund, because that is going to be so important to building back. I've asked for the evidence to be made clear about why primary schools are closing, but not nursery schools. And a business rates holiday for maintained state nurseries, which have to pay business rates but don't get holiday. Why is that? And for the funding for COVID the funding for now to be based on the pre-COVID register, not the COVID register, because I know that that's lower. At least we've got out the way of absences. So if there are absences, those children will still be counted, but they will, for private settings, that they should be able to look back to COVID, pre-COVID times, because that's the costs that everyone has. But in overall terms, the 4 points that I just wanted to make, and if I had longer, I would talk more about Sure Start. I'm absolutely a huge fan of Sure Start. I used to work in a community centre just before I became an MP, and every day I would look out onto a building that had been our local Sure Start centre and mourned the loss of it in our community. It did decrease the disadvantage. It was really well evaluated, and we've seen that currently the child centres and family hubs, whatever we're calling them in our local authorities, they are not up to task, I don't think, and they're not being evaluated as well as they should be, as has been found out in a recent report as well. State-maintained nurseries need to have more funding, multi-year funding, and that business rates holiday. My second point would be that concerns that early year settings and closures and the impact of that will be in the most disadvantaged areas. So the place where we need to have the nurseries, private and state maintained, we will have fewer of them at the end of COVID, and there needs to be a better sufficiency study by local authorities able to make sure that we have the funding for nurseries to continue after COVID. There are lots of statistics showing how many nurseries are closing, but how many nurseries on the brink of closure, and that could be saved by a proper financial package. Now, looking at sufficiency at a much broader level and making sure that we put early years education as a really high priority because of its effect on social mobility. We should be doing that. Early years workforce would be my next point, and that's been talked about a lot as well, but I would echo the fact that the 2017 early years workforce strategy in England failed to put in place a long-term plan to upskill and invest the early years workforce, and a key commitment to grow the graduate workforce in disadvantaged areas especially was dropped. And I know there's been a lot of talk about the graduate pay and other issues in the chat box, which is really interesting. It's a debate we need to have. We need to have that debate about the workforce, but also the reduction in local authority central spend under the early years national formula to a maximum of 5% going to the local authority has reduced the capacity within local authorities to provide that professional development support and targeted support for disadvantaged communities, and that additional layer of support for the early years workforce, which I think is a mistake and we're really missing. And I was also going to talk more about the 30 years a week free childcare and whether it's really helping the sector and the disadvantage there. So I'm a member of the Education Select Committee before my time, but very, very well worth reading, and I really would recommend it, is the Disadvantage in Early Years report of 2019. And that report found that the government's 30 hours funded childcare policy is entrenching inequality rather than closing the gap. But also there's social mobility of parents as well. And in the community centre where I worked, I ran a lifelong learning programme and English language programme, but parents weren't able to access that because they weren't working and they didn't have access to the free funding for their children. And we ran a creche right in the same place as the teaching, and that was the only way that mums were able to access that education and therefore go on to get jobs, to be socially mobile themselves. But that has been increasingly cut. There are very few English language teaching centres now which have childcare attached in a way that it's not at a distance, it's from 6 months onwards. It's all those things that a young mum needs to be able to get to education. And there's something there which the 30 years and the 15 years doesn't tackle as well in terms of tackling inequality. And we need to look again at that policy too. I'd like to end by quoting from a letter from my local head teachers and just to bring their voice into it and how they're feeling at the moment. They say, but who are we, the forgotten educators who ensure that people continue to work knowing their precious children will be cared for and educated safely with high quality? We're in trouble. We need your help. We've been given no support for PPE or to implement extra hygienic measures. Our staff are putting themselves at risk every day, and we do it willingly. We do it because we're early years professionals and we care. But please, we need help.
Thank you. If everyone can put themselves on there.
If early years centres go bankrupt because of lack of government support, who will look after our children, your children in the future? I think we need to listen a lot to our early years educators, practitioners, teachers, and consider where we go in the future for the early years sector. Thank you very much.
Fleur, thank you. And we found a lot of common ground, did we not, in the debate?
Absolutely.
I'm sure
Yes.
that you are making those points to your front bench, as I am to mine. And I think it's great when we do that. And then we have consistency of message from the back benches and from the other front benches. I think that makes a huge difference in clarity of message to get across the minister. We have a stop today on 4 o'clock. So I'm going to stop the meeting there, but I'm just going to thank all of our speakers and the minister for joining us and remind everybody that we have the Childcare and Early Education Week taking place from the 25th to 29th of January. If you have a look at our social medias, you will see the different things that are on there. I've got a video that Hannah wants me to record, which I should do, and ping over to you, Hannah, and Fleur. There'll be plenty of ways for you and other MPs to be involved in that. So we will be in touch with the details of the next meeting, and as ever, we'll post the recording of this session on our social media pages. But thank you, everybody, for all you do. Thank you for joining the call, but most importantly, thank you for what you're doing for our brilliant early years sector. Thank you so much. God bless. Stay safe, everyone.